Follow the King by Doug Whitley. Read by Doug Whitley. In October of 937 A.D., there was a great battle that united England under King Aethelstan, who history tells us was a pious and learned king. He was the grandson of Alfred the Great. No one knows the exact location, but history describes this battle with these words: "Never yet within this island has there been a greater slaughter of folk felled by swords' edges." This is the story of a young man who chose to follow the king. The shock of the blow ran through Edric's arm and shoulder like lightning. He had never felt such a jolt before. He nearly dropped his sword. He stepped back with a look of hurt and surprise on his face as Alaric pressed his advantage and knocked him down with his lowered shoulder. "Never hesitate. If I'd been a Pict or a Norseman, you'd be dead with your head on the ground. What do you think fighting was going to be like, picking daisies?" Edric looked up from the ground at his teacher with fire in his eyes. "And don't lose your temper. It only clouds your thinking and makes you too rash in your attack. I'm trying to save your life, and your father the grief of losing you. Now, again." The attacks went on, swords raised, the clash of metal on metal as the lessons continued. Sweat was pouring from Edric's body, and his arms could feel the burn of the weight of the sword and shield. His mail shirt hung heavily on his body over the padded undercoat. His legs were weary with the constant feint, attack, spin, forward, backward, attack, duck. After what seemed an eternity, the lesson ceased, and he and Alaric took water from the bucket with a horn dipper. Edric ladled the cool water over his head, and then drank from the dipper, the water from his head mixing with what missed his mouth and flowed down his smooth chin and soaked into his clothes. "We'll take a bit of a break and start again." Alaric's voice was very serious. Usually there were some joking taunts passed back and forth from the younger to the older man, and back again. But today everything was serious, and Edric did not know why. They skirmished for another hour with only small intervals for water now and again, until finally Alaric called a halt. "Why are we training so much, and why are you so serious today?" Edric asked. Alaric took a long look at his young pupil, and in his rough brogue began. "Bjorn, your father, was my friend. He's the king's reeve, his district governor. This you know. Did you not see the messengers going in and out the gates for the last 2 days? War is brewing. King Aethelstan has been working hard to unite his grandfather Alfred's kingdom under one ruler, with the petty western kings of smaller fiefdoms and the northern warlords and the Norse-Irish invaders not liking it and threatening to rebel at every turn. The accord agreed on by Constantine in Scotland is chafing, and he wants to be free of Aethelstan, and the peace has come to an end. We are going to war. This will be no minor skirmish between the king's men and some Viking raiders, but a pitched battle of thousands, and I'm getting you ready for it. Battle is like nothing you've ever faced before. This battle will be like nothing anyone has ever faced before. Each encounter will move slowly like the shadow on the sundial. It will seem like hours, but it will take only a few moments, decided in an instant with a stroke of a blade, the swing of an axe, the thrust of a spear, the flight of an arrow. Other than killing your first boar with a spear last year, you've never faced someone trying to kill you. Well, in battle it happens over and over and over again. You take one man down, perhaps he's killed, perhaps he's only wounded, some filled with hate, some with fear, some with pride, but all trying to do you harm. Then there's another, and another one after that, and you feel as though you could not lift your arm again or parry one more blow, and you watch someone you know go down beside you, but you keep on going because if you don't, you'll be next. Is any of this sinking into that thick head of yours? I'm a talking to myself. This battle may very well be the biggest ever fought on our own soil, and many will die, and I don't want you to be one of them." Edric's mouth went dry, and the color drained from his face. Battles were something that happened somewhere else. Isolated fights between raiders or the Irish seeking slaves, between a few dozen men on either side. tales of valor from the old lore. This was war. He was afraid, not only for himself, but for his father, his family, the king. They will make peace like last time. The Scots, the Danes, and the Irish, they always have. King Constantine II knows he cannot win by himself. Even I know that. Yes, boy, but it's not only him this time. His nephew is Owen of Cumbria, who is himself a new king, and King Olaf of Ireland and Denmark is his son-in-law. No, there are 3 armies against 2 this time. Constantine's 3 against King Aethelstan's armies of Wessex and Mercia. And they hate us, boy. They hate us. Aethelstan is changing everything. He loves learning, and I believe he loves God as we do. He wants everyone to learn to read and write. He has a vision for a united kingdom with 1 language and 1 ruler. He is a godly and pious man. He builds churches and funds scholars. He's well deserving of our loyalty. But he will change everything, and the others don't like that. He wants law. He wants justice. They want to loot and pillage and take as they please. He wants to protect the innocent. They want to slaughter them. This isn't just about a battle. It's about life itself and how we live it. Now, that's enough sermonizing for one day. Go clean up, boy, and head to your other lessons. Edric made his way to his room in the keep. It was old, a mixture of stone and wood set on high ground. Bits of it went back to the Roman rule. At least some of the stones had Latin inscriptions cut into them. It was odd to see the Latin word carved in stone in the middle of a wall, and wonder where the rest of it was set. The stone had been chosen because it fit the space. It was the same in the church. The chapel had been built out of the stone ruins of some Roman building left over when the emperor pulled all the soldiers off Hadrian's wall 500 years ago. He always thought it was funny to see the sundial cut into the lintel stone at the church entrance, because, well, he could always see how long the priest's homily had taken from the time he went in until the time he went out. He thought the builder had a secret sense of humor when he set that stone. His feet scuffed through the rushes of the plank floor put down to keep out the cold of the coming winter through the bottom of leather boots. It was high fall now. Harvest was continuing. The reapers were in the field. The leaves had turned and the air was growing crisp. Edric was headed back to his room to clean up before the noon meal. His mail shirt and weapons he left at the armory. He was clad now in his padded jerkin. His arms were sore from the training. He washed himself at the ewer, dried himself with one of the rough woven towels hanging on the iron hook beside the raised bowl. Edric had given the glowing brazier a stir when he came into the room. He changed quickly into a woven long green tunic, and wrapped the leather belt around him, fastening it with his silver-headed serpent clasp. He had slipped it through the leather loop in his dagger sheath, and now his dagger hung by his side. Edric sat on the edge of his feather bed with his head in his hands, and thought about what his teacher and mentor had said. War, he thought to himself. War and fighting and death. He was not worried about death so much as about dying. He believed he would go to heaven when he died. The memory of his mother's voice came back to him. They had been traveling in her wagon to the fair. His father was riding ahead with their guards, and a much younger Alaric. His mother, Quinhild, traveled comfortably in her tapestry-hung wagon, ensconced on the pillows with him beside her. They came to a crossroads, and there had been a great carved stone cross there where the roads met. "What is that, mother?" his childish voice had asked. "It is a cross, my son." "What does it mean?" "It is a symbol, a sign." "Like a road sign? A symbol for what? Does it tell us how to get somewhere?" His mother smiled. "So many questions, young one." "It is a symbol and a sign as well. Certainly it will help you on your path. Many years ago, there was a man named Jesus. He lived in the Holy Land in the East, and he was the Son of God." "Oh, I know of him. We learned of him at church from Father Anselm. Yes, yet it is the same man. He turned water into wine. He opened the eyes of the blind man. He fed 5,000 on a hillside from 5 loaves and 2 fishes that little boy gave to the disciples. I gave my fish to Father Anselm last week, but I think he just fed himself. His mother smiled again. Yes, Jesus did all those things. Did Father Anselm tell you what happened to him? No, we haven't gotten that part of the story yet. Well, this man, Jesus, who had never sinned, died on a cross to pay our debt of sin to God the Father. And that cross reminds us of what he did and how much we need him. You know about sin, don't you? I know I disobey sometimes, and that is a sin. Yes. Well, we've all disobeyed. We've all broken God's law. Even Father? Even you? He remembered his mother's smile when he asked her that. Yes, even me. So we all should put on a cross? His mother grew silent for a moment, and then spoke. Yes. Yes, there should have been a cross for every person that ever walked the earth, because we have all sinned and cannot reach up to God. But he reached down to us. Jesus died for us, in our place, for all of us, so that there was only one cross. The others are a reminder of what he has done. So what do I have to do? Do? Yes, Mother, what do I have to do to get Jesus to take my cross? She smiled again. Believe, my son. Believe that he died in our place and ask him to take your place. Right now? If you like. Out loud? It needn't be out loud. Only if you want to. Edric remembered how he had bowed his head and silently mouthed the words as best he understood, to ask Jesus to take his place. He remembered the peace that filled his young heart, and filled it still, at least until Alaric started talking about war. There was a lot of pain between dying and dead in war, and that gave him pause. He'd seen the men who'd lost limbs or an eye in battle, scarred for life. Some of them begged at the gates of the town. Others were scorned because of their disfigurement. After the meal, Edric finished his other lessons for the day, working with the tutors his father had brought in to teach him mathematics, Latin, Welsh, French, and the language of the Vikings. "Know how to talk to your enemies, son," his father had said when he asked why he was learning these languages. He completed his other subjects and went down to the great hall for the evening meal. He noticed as he walked the rush-strewn flagstones the worried looks on the servants who passed him. He saw the messengers coming and going from his father's rooms like bees to the hive. There was a tension in the air that he had never felt before. The hall was filled with strangers, men with stern and battle-scarred faces, men who never smiled. He caught fragments of their conversations. Kings Constantine, Olaf, and Owen were frequently mentioned. He heard the words appeasement and the French parler. He heard battle, gathering armies. Several times he caught his father looking at him with an intense gaze that turned away as soon as Edric was aware of it. With the meal over, some of the men went off to their rooms, but others stayed by the main hearth or the braziers set in the floor, and spoke quietly but intently among themselves. The flames, throwing a golden haze on the smoke, caught in the rafters. His father held himself aloof from these conversations, and would not be drawn from their oblique questions. Edric just listened, not knowing which way the wind blew or what his father really thought. The days passed. Alaric filled each of them with his battle training. The rest was schooling. Edric's arms were filling out, and whatever baby fat left on his body was gone. He moved easily with his sword and with the axe. Holding his shield was second nature to him now. He was becoming a warrior. The lands surrounding the keep filled with the tents of the gathering army, banners flying over each one like poppies in a meadow. There were hundreds now that had to be fed and watered. There were horses picketed in long lines in the field. Wrapped in his long cloak, Edric walked through the camp, listening to the voices from all over England. He heard the soft rolling brogue of the Welsh from the far side of Offa's dyke, the harsh, sharp accents of London, and the broad vowels of Devon. Each night his father entertained the leaders of these men in the great hall, assessing, listening, discerning. Edric found himself doing the same as he watched these men, trying to gain influence with his father, trying to get more for themselves, trying to manipulate his father. One or two of them even tried with him. He got very good at playing the careless young man until they stopped taking him seriously. Word got around. Every day with Alaric was a lesson in statecraft as well as sword play, and Edric was learning, growing wiser as well as stronger. Alaric shared his faith, his knowledge, and his wisdom as they duelled day after grueling day. The day came when Edric arrived for his lesson, that his father was there in the training ground in his mail with his great sword. Edric settled his helmet on his head, took hold of his shield and sword, but when he stepped into the fighting circle it was his father who faced him and not Alaric. The lesson began slowly, each taking the measure of the other. He had never faced a great sword before. His father handled it as if it were nothing. As the lesson went along, his father began to press him more and more. The sheer weight of the great sword was enough to disarm him had he not gripped his own weapon all the tighter. His father's face held no expression, no smile, no grimace, not even any strain. Then the pace picked up until the blows were flying so quickly it was hard to see the weapons except for the light flashing on the blades and the frozen tableau made whenever Eric caught the great blade on his shield or the hilts on his own sword. Forward and back in a wild and dangerous Morris dance, until the fear and frustration began to tell on Edric. What was his father trying to do? He thought. Every feint, every attack his father met and quelled, the great sword like a wall between them. Then he saw his chance. His father had swung the blade through the air to bring it down on Edric's shield. Edric pushed it wide and rushed in close to his father under the blade, and put his sword tip on his father's neck. His father smiled. But then his gaze looked up. Edric's eyes followed his father's, and he saw that what he thought would have been a successful attack would have ended with both their deaths. His father's armored gauntlets wrapped around his sword hilts were poised above Edric's head. He would have been crushed even had his sword struck home. He dropped his head, but instead of berating him, his father embraced him and smiled. "Well done, my son. Well done. You have learned well. Now, go and change for your other lessons. We will speak later." His father nodded to the smiling Alaric and left. Edric was smiling as well. He knew he had passed some test. He just wasn't sure what it was. "Well done, boy! Well done!" Alaric exclaimed. That night, after the evening meal, Edric strode through the great hall, searching for his father. No one could tell Edric where he was, not even his mother, Gwenhild. After a fruitless search through the keep and the great hall, Edric found himself outside the fortress palings, at the chapel entrance, staring at the old sundial set into the stone, its shadow now following the moonlight. He heard his father's voice coming through the small arched window in the door. At first Edric thought there was someone else with his father, and they were discussing something, arguing over something. He had rarely heard his father speak so intensely. Edric listened, waiting for the discussion to end before he entered. Then he heard his own name. Slowly he lifted the latch that held the door, and silently entered the room. He could see no one but his father. There he was on his knees at the altar, hands clasped, head bowed, with tears in his voice as he prayed aloud for his son. Edric went to the nearest bench and sat, bowing his own head out of respect. His father's words washed over him, echoing in the cavernous stone chapel. He heard his father's words of pleading and love addressed to Abba, Father, just as if his father were talking to a real person, not the air above the altar. Edric had never heard his father pray like this. Grace before a meal, that he had heard. Prayers with him at night as a child, Edric remembered. But this was something else. His father, like the stories of Jacob of old, seemed to be wrestling with God. He heard his father's Amen, and watched him rise slowly from his knees. His father started when he saw Edric there on the bench. "Have you been here long?" "I was looking for you, and had tried everywhere else. I heard your voice. I saw that you were alone, and I came in to wait." His father nodded. They were both standing awkwardly, not quite looking at each other. "What is on your mind? Please, sit." They sat. Not side by side, but his father straddling a bench in the front row with his long dagger angling to the flagstone floor, turning himself to face his son in the second row. Edric leaned forward, arms on his knees. "Is there going to be war, Father?" "Oh, yes. Oh, yes, the kings of the north have been raiding the border cities for the last month. Every day brings news of their atrocities. Aethelstan, many think, has been slow to respond, but he's been gathering the army until there is a force large enough to meet Olaf, Owen, and Constantine. He knew that a skirmish for a border town would not solve the problem. The king has a vision for the future. The lesser kings, the warlords, the chieftains, they want the old ways to continue and will not be subdued." "What will you do?" "I am the king's reeve. I will follow the king as my father and grandfather followed Aethelstan's grandfather Alfred and his father Edward. I will follow him because it is my duty, but I follow him more so because it is right. What he wants is right, and so I do follow him." "And there will be war?"
"Oh, yes.
"Yes, there will be war."
"And people will die?"
"Yes, people will die. Unless the other yield, and they are too full of their own importance to do that. People will die. Perhaps a great many of them, I am sorry to say. There is news that the Danes who inhabit Ireland sailed from Scotland to make their way south over water, landing in the northwest. We must meet this force to protect the kingdom. We will need every man, and so I am asking you to join us. It will be dangerous. It may even be deadly."
"I will go with you. I will follow you."
Edric spoke the words to his father evenly. "It is not enough for you to follow me, as much as I appreciate that, but you must follow the king. He is our ruler. He is our liege lord. It is he who will lead this battle. It is he who will lead England."
"I will follow him, even though, Father, I do not know him. I have never met him. I only know what Alaric has shared with me, but I also know that you follow him, and that will be enough."
His father dropped his head and felt the weight of his son's choice on his own shoulders. He took a long, slow breath and began. "Word has come that the Irish and Scottish flotillas have set sail. We will gather our army as we go. Since he became king, Aethelstan has ordered garrisons a day's ride apart to protect the surrounding towns and villages across the Southland. We will meet Constantine with roughly 15,000 men against their 15,000 by all accounts. We head for the north, near the Scottish border by the coast. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we ride."
His father laid his hand on Edric's shoulder and squeezed it gently. Edric could feel the warmth of his father's hands through the rough fabric of his tunic. He felt his father's love as well. Edric's mother was packing his things into a trunk when he arrived at his room. From the doorway he watched her fold each item carefully and place it gently in the iron-bound wooden trunk that would go with the wagons that followed the army. She was humming softly.
He recognized the tune as a chant in Latin. For a moment he just stood and watched her, listening to her clear, soft voice. She held a bittersweet smile on her lips. She pressed one of his shirts that she had woven for him to her lips and put it in the trunk. She finished packing as he watched, and closed and latched the trunk. "You knew I would go, then?" "Yes. I believed you would. You are becoming a man with a man's choices. Choosing to follow the king, with all that that means. That is a man's choice. A woman's too, come to that. I, too, have fought the raiders as a young warrior maiden in my time, although I used a bow to defend our village, not a blade. I do know what awaits you. What you do is right, and I am at peace with your choice, as difficult as it is." "You fought? You killed?" "Yes. I was just your age. My father was the local chieftain, your grandsire for whom you are named. He taught me to hunt and shoot as well as to read, alongside my brothers, your uncles. So when the alarm was sounded, and everyone grabbed their bows and arrows, I took my quiver and bow along with the others. Your grandfather took a look at me and said, 'Come, we will need every bow. Mind you have your dagger as well if you are captured.' My hands were shaking so I could hardly nock the arrow. Then I saw one of the marauders grab a small girl, and before I could think I had loosed an arrow and saw it pierce his throat. He let go the girl and fell like a stone. And then there were other lives to save, and others to take. It seemed the work of a moment, but we were at it most of the night, caring for the wounded, putting out the fires, burying the dead. By morning, exhaustion had overwhelmed us, but the village was safe, and it was not for the last time." Edric was silent for a moment, picturing his mother as a fierce warrior maiden. Then he spoke. "Mother, I do have a question." "Yes?" "We have often spoken of spiritual things, things of the church, things of the Lord, but how does war fit in with what Jesus says about turning the other cheek, about not defending oneself? That is a theologian's question, but I will tell you what I think. When I fought the raiders with the bow, it was not to defend myself, but our village. Your father also has, in his time, fought to protect those in need of a champion. And now, as he goes to war, and you with him, it is to defend those who cannot defend themselves. It is to protect the village, the villages, indeed, from being raided, the maidens from harm, the children from being taken and sold as slaves. Might does not make right, but it may require might to defend that which is right. That is the best answer my wit can give you." He nodded silently. With that she took his head in her hands and kissed him on his forehead. "God go with you, my son." And she left. Edric paced about the room for a bit, and then readied himself for bed. He lay awake on his mattress long into the night, his thoughts in a turmoil for the coming battle. Would he be brave? Would he be able to defend the king? Would he survive the battle? Would he survive it unscathed, unscarred. Edric would doze and awaken from some fresh apparition of battle and death, over and over again in fitful sleep, until the dawn began to show in the windows of his room. He finally arose, splashed himself awake with the water in his ewer, dressed himself for travel. His baggage had already been taken by the servants. He had his sword belt and sword with him in his room. He strapped them on over his tunic and went to meet his father to break his fast. He might not be able to sleep soundly, but he found that he could eat. After breaking his fast with his father and the other leaders riding with them to meet Constantine's army, Edric sought out his mother to bid her farewell. She was somber and silent as he kissed her cheek and held her hands in parting. Life was hard, and sometimes short. She knew no good would come of wailing and tears. It was in the hands of God now. Her son, her husband, the king, and the men who followed him were all in God's hands. She went to the palisade gate to watch the army ride away. The procession's slow progress wound its way through the valley until she could only see the blurred shapes of the luggage wagons through her tears. When she could no longer see them, she turned and went to her rooms with her needlework to await her long and lonely vigil. Many days would pass before there would be news. 20 miles was as much as the army could hope to travel on a good day to arrive at the meeting strong enough to fight, and it would take them many days before they would join the other elements of King Aethelstan's army and face the Danes, the Scots, and the Irish on the Wirral. It was mid-September, and the days were growing cooler and shorter. By the third day, the pattern of making camp, training with Alaric, eating, more training, sleep, breaking camp, and journeying on had set itself. Edric said little as he rode in the vanguard with his father. Alaric was there riding close to Edric's father as well. He was ever watchful for the hidden blade, the arrow's flight. Edric listened to the conversations of the men around him. Some were joking. Some made coarse talk. It was all a show of bravery by men afraid of dying. There were bitter words for those on the other side of the border who had broken the peace, and bold guesses at Aethelstan's battle plan on a peninsula filled with the enemy. The days passed slowly with the wearying journey. Each day the foresters and huntsmen would seek out fuel and food for the massive army that flowed like the tide across the fields and forests of England. Each day, when the horses had been seen to and the camp pitched, Edric and Alaric would train, occasionally joined by his father with his great sword. Watching his father and Alaric train was more like watching a chess match than the all-out sword-clashing bouts between Edric and his mentor. After what seemed like an age to Edric, the column of riders and men reached the king and his army in the northwest of England, near the marshy stretches of the Wirral. When they crested the low hills that surrounded the plain like the lip of a bowl, Edric could see the army laid out before him with tents and banners like a city made of cloth. The wind blew constant and strong and cold across the water. Even the low trees were shaped by the ever-present wind. They made their way to the outward edges, still unoccupied with tents, and once again began to make camp. A messenger came to his father from the king. Bjorn read it and said to Edric, "Make yourself presentable and come with me, quickly. Aethelstan does not like to be kept waiting." Edric got down from his horse and hit his dusty tunic with his gauntlets a few times, and ran his fingers through his hair. That was the extent of his grooming. His father gave a small chuckle and turned on his heel. Edric began to follow rapidly behind him. They laced their way through the mass of men and animals until they found themselves at the opening of a large tent with sumptuous banners floating in the sky above them.
They were announced by the servant sent to fetch them, and left at the entrance to the king's tent. Edric took one more look at himself, and took another swat with his leather gauntlets. He licked his lips and swallowed hard. "In you go," his father said. Edric walked between the armed sentries into the presence of the king. At first glance the tent had a wooden floor. Candle stands stood in the four corners of the room, and there was another lamp suspended from cross members in the ceiling. There was a bronze ewer in one corner and a brazier in the other. An ornate cot ran along one side of the large tent, set in the midst of heavy bed curtains to keep in the heat and keep out the light. The tent was redolent with some kind of incense that wafted through the air from a small burner on its own stand. Aethelstan sat on a raised platform in an elaborately carved chair. His simple crown glinted on his reddish-blond head. His beard was full, but it did not cover the bejeweled chain around his neck. The famous golden-hilted sword given to him by his grandfather, King Alfred, stretched across the table before him. Also on the table were several maps drawn on vellum, held open by a jeweled dagger on the one side and an ink-pot on the other. Several heavily bound books with beautifully embossed bindings lay haphazardly on the desk, as if the king had been reading them one after another. Aethelstan rose when the men had entered and stepped in front of the oak table. Edric wasn't sure what to do. He had never met a king before. He took a sidelong glance at his father, who was bowing, and so he bowed, again watching his father to see just how low and how long he should bow before the king. Aethelstan motioned for them to rise. The king smiled and grasped Bjorn's forearm, pulling him toward him in a strong clasp of hands. "It is good to see you again, Bjorn, my friend. I hope you have had a safe journey." "All went well, my liege. May I present my son, Edric?" Aethelstan appraised Edric for a moment before he spoke. "There is a light of intelligence in your eyes, young man. Have you education?" Edric hesitated. "You may speak." Edric cleared his throat. His first words came out as a kind of creaking falsetto reminiscent of his voice change. Sire, my father believes education is a good thing." "So it is. It has fallen on hard times of late. Some of our priests cannot read or write, not to mention the majority of our people. How are we to learn and follow God if we cannot read his word? I am proposing a translation of the Holy Scriptures in our common tongue, so that all Englishmen who can read the Scriptures for themselves. I am not sure how it will fare with the Church. So, you read?" "Yes, sire." "Languages?" "Sire, again my father believes that one should know the language of the enemy, and so I speak the language of the Vikings, but I speak the language of the French as well, and Latin. I am also studying the language of our neighbours, the Welsh." "Well done, young man. Do you read them?" "Yes, sire." "Here, let me show you something." Aethelstan grabbed Edric by the sleeve and pulled him around the desk. He picked up one of the books, flipped the clasp, and gently opened the book. Edric saw that it was an illustrated manuscript in Latin, beautifully colored and finely drawn. Aethelstan thrust it in his hand. Edric began to read in the Latin, translating in his mind as it went. It was from the Bible. It was an account of the battles of the Hebrew people. "I find that the Hebrews are very good at battle plans. The man Joshua in particular, King David too. So I look to them for inspiration when I go into battle. What do you think?" Edric read on. It was a record of a battle in which the Israelites had pretended to be defeated, and they ran. When the enemy pursued them, other warriors in hiding closed in on the enemy from behind and defeated them. "That sounds like a very wise plan, sire. Very, very cunning." "Yes, that's what I thought. And since our opponents don't read, and they certainly don't read the Bible, I think it will be a surprise to them as well. But you must keep that information to yourself. Here." Aethelstan reached another small volume from his desk. It was beautifully bound in embossed leather and stained blue and chased with gold over a wooden cover with a gold clasp on the slim volume. "It is the Gospel of St. John. I wish for you to have it. I treasure learning, and those who are willing to learn. It is my gift to you. The Lord be with you as we go into battle. And now, my young friend, you must excuse me, but the pressure of the kingdom intrudes." The king nodded to Edric and his father as they turned and made their way back to their own men in camp. "Well, now you have met the king. What did you think?" He could see the light of hero worship already in his son's eyes. I don't know what to think. Whatever I was expecting, he is certainly not it." Edric ran his hands over the beautiful leather of his book. I suppose from what Alaric had said, and from the things I heard you and the others discussing around the table, I thought he would be smaller, and perhaps a little bent over from learning, someone more like a scholar, or at least what I think of as a scholar, more like Father Anselm. Aethelstan is more, I think, like King David must have looked." "Yes, and we are going to slay a giant named Constantine. Get your cloak. We shall walk among the men." Edric fetched his cloak from his baggage, and with his father began to walk through the camp. Alaric followed at a discreet distance. His father would step into a group of men and ask after their journey, their families, their needs. He did this over and over again. Some of the men he knew better than others, but each group received attention. Edric followed silently, watching, listening as they went from group to group, campfire to campfire. Then they returned to their own tent. "Tomorrow we will ride to meet the enemy. An army this size cannot stay in one place too long. The countryside will not sustain it. All the wood gets burned and the game eaten, and there was never much here to start with." "Will there be fighting tomorrow?" Edric asked as he prepared for bed. His own cot looked very welcoming. "Probably not. We will ride out to meet Constantine, Olaf, and Owen. There will be delegations sent back and forth. There will be some show of attack. There are usually taunts, insults shouted back and forth between the men. There always are. After that, we will see." "My son, the king gave you a book. I, too, possess some learning, and this is something I translated from the Latin when I was your age. I have written it out for you, but I have it in my head from memory. It is from the Psalms. It is the 91st Psalm. I hope it will be as encouraging and comforting to you as it has been to me." His father handed him a piece of rolled parchment with the words inscribed upon it. And then his father began to quote aloud. "He who is dwelling in the secret place of the Most High, in the shade of the Mighty, lodgeth habitually. He is saying of Jehovah, my refuge, my bulwark, my God, in him I trust. For he delivereth thee from the snare of a fowler, from the calamitous pestilence. With his pinion he covereth thee over, and under his wings thou dost trust. A shield and buckler is his truth. Thou art not afeared by night of the arrow that flieth, of pestilence and thick darkness that walketh, of destruction that destroyeth at noon. There fall at thy right side 1,000, and 1,000,000 at thy right hand. Unto thee it cometh not nigh. But with thine eyes thou lookest, and the reward of wicked thou seest. For thou, O Jehovah, art my refuge. The Most High thou madest thy habitation. Evil happeneth not unto thee, and a plague cometh not near thy tent. For his messengers he chargeth for thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. On the hands they bear thee up, lest thou smite against a stone thy foot. On lion and asp thou treadest, thou trampest young lion and dragon. Because in me he hath delighted, I also deliver him. I set him on high, because he hath known my name. He doth call me, and I answer him. I am with him in distress, and I deliver him and honour him. With length of days I satisfy him, and I cause him to look on my salvation. And my son Paul, Saint Paul, the Apostle, wrote to Timotheus, his son in the ministry, God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind. Tomorrow we go out to meet the enemy. Very soon there will be fighting, perhaps not tomorrow, as I said, but very soon. I do not wish you to allow your fear to control you. Whatever occurs, God will be with you. I will be riding in the vanguard with the king. You and Alaric with you will be a part of the army that hides until this trap is sprung. My son, these words do not come easily for me, because it is not our way to wear our hearts on our sleeve, but I wish for you to know that I love you. I love you. Edric looked at his father and then embraced him. I love you too, my father. They made themselves ready for bed. His father blew out the lamp, and they slept. All too soon for Edric, his father shook him gently awake. They broke their fast with some cold meats, cheese and bread, water to drink. They began to ready themselves for battle. Alaric came in to help each of them get into the padded jerkin and pull the chainmail over their heads. It was then laced up tight. Over that came a tabard that marked them as the king's men. A simple bowl-shaped helmet over the chainmail hood finished their armor. Edric remembered Alaric's words about the helmet with the nose-piece. It's like a handle to your enemy. If he gets that close, and chances are he will, he can grab you by that and swing you around like a cat. Keep your sight free and protect your nose, along with the rest of your young hide. Edric smiled at this memory and wondered if he would smile again for the next few days. Dawn came cloaked in the peaty campfires of 30,000 men. Bjorn mounted his enormous black stallion from a block and rode to join the king. Alaric and Edric would be on foot. They joined the others of his father's men and made their way silently to the copse of low trees stunted by the constant sea breeze from the north. There was no talking now, or jesting. Just the soft chink of chainmail, the whisper of leather as they moved through the trees. Aethelstan had given orders that those with him in the forefront were to spread out, to give the appearance of a larger group, and yet let those who noted such things see that there were not so many of the king's men as there were of the enemy. As the sun rose on the cold October morning, Edric could see the clouds of breath from the nostrils of the great horses in the distance. He felt the ground shake as the riders and their massive mounts moved slowly into place. This would be the cavalry, those who would be first. In spite of the cold, he was sweating. He looked at Alaric and saw his battle face. There was a stern rictus on his countenance. No emotion showed. His eyes were fixed on the distance, and only the slightest movement of his lips as he breathed showed that Alaric was animate at all. The two armies were in place, facing one another. All was silent. Then there was a clash of sword on shield, loud enough to wake the dead, and terrible in its knolling boom from Constantine's men. There were at first harsh shouts from their enemy, answered by Aethelstan's men in their own low call, with an echoing crash of their own. And then the taunts began. Edric had not known such words to exist, and he blushed under his armor to hear what the enemy was saying. There came answering threats from Aethelstan's men with equal ferocity, and it went on and on and on throughout the day, as Edric and Alaric and the men with them, hidden in the trees, remained silent, and slowly grew colder and colder. Just before dark there was a charge from the Scots and the Danes that caught Aethelstan's men by surprise, and some were killed and wounded. A shout went up as the Danes and Scots pulled back, one of them carrying high on a spear the severed head of one of Aethelstan's men. Then darkness fell, and both sides returned to their camps for the night. This was the manner in which war was waged. The night passed slowly. There was little said between father and son as they went through the motions of the evening like automatons. There in the darkness, as they lay in their cots, Bjorn's voice came quietly out of the darkness. "I love you, son." "I love you, father." And all was quiet. Again the daybreak came quickly and quietly for Edric as they made their way for battle. "Today there will be an attack. Aethelstan will provoke them. When the horns sound, you will close the trap that Aethelstan has designed. Remember what Alaric has taught you. Remember that God is with you. Remember I love you." With that, Bjorn mounted his steed and rode off to join the king in his vanguard with the others on horseback. Alaric laced him into his mail, and they set out again like the day before toward the low woods. Again all was silent, except the low sounds of 2,000 men moving as quietly as they may through the woods. Edric knew there were another 2,000 in the copse across from the open field where yesterday's show had taken place, and today's preliminaries were beginning. All began as it had the day before, with the clashing of shields and the threats and the taunts across the open space. But when the sun was up, and strong in the eyes of the enemy facing east, Aethelstan struck. There was a flight of arrows to darken the sky. Edric heard the shrieks of those who could not get under the shield wall, or those whose necks had been found through the spaces by the silent arrows of Aethelstan's archers. Then Aethelstan's army began to charge. The Danes and the Scots lowered the long pointed spears to stave off the men on horseback. The enemy gave a great shout and ran to meet the attack. Edric could hear the guttural roar of the men. Some were shouting battle cries, "Constantine! Owen!" Others were swearing in Danish with their long plaited beards tucked into their leather armor, swinging their axes and their war hammers over their heads. There was a clash as the two armies met like the breaking of a wave upon the rocks of the sea. The air was split by the sound of metal on metal, intermingled with the cries and shouts Edric could not quite understand. Still Aethelstan's men on either side of the battle line stayed silent and still, so that their position would not be betrayed by the flash of a blade or the sound of a voice. Then the king's men in the forefront began to fall back, some turning and running. There was a victorious shout from the Danes and the Scots behind them as they began to pursue. It was as if the floodgates had burst and let the full tide of the enemy army pursue Aethelstan's beleaguered men. The race went on and on for nearly half a mile, allowing all of Constantine's army to come between the jaws of the trap. When Constantine himself, with Kings Owen and Olaf, brought up the rear of the flow with their banners and personal guards, the horn began to blow. There was a loud, clear call from the deep booming horns, and in an instant Edric, Alaric, and all those with them began to close in on the unsuspecting Scots. There was a flight of arrows from the hidden archers that found its way into the exposed backs of the enemy dogging the retreat. The jaws of the great trap had begun to close. The charge began slowly, picking up speed as those in the front found their feet and judged their path. Those following then could also pick up speed, and soon the two sides of the trap were converging quickly on the right and left flanks of the enemy. Those at the rear of Constantine's charge were caught completely unaware.
Stragglers were cut down and silenced quickly. Then the onslaught caught up with the main body of the enemy. Someone must have turned to look behind them, because there suddenly arose a shout of warning that spread as Constantine's army lost its momentum and began circling to protect the kings. A fire arrow went up from the archers with Edric to signal Aethelstan that the trap had been sprung, and those running must now turn and fight. A shield wall began to form in front of Edric, Alaric, and those with them. Edric brought his sword down on the shoulder of one Dane who could not get his shield arm up quickly enough to ward off the blow. The man went down, and Edric went on to the next man in front of him. His arm raised and dropped in deadly action against those before him. All the days of fighting with Alaric had made the motion almost without thought. His shield came up to ward off a blow, and then his sword struck home under the guard of the blond Norseman before him. His eyes slid sideways for a moment, and there was Alaric in a fury, swinging his battle-axe to cut down another enemy. Alaric caught Edric's eye, and he shouted, "Pay attention, you young fool! Don't stand there gawping!" Edric caught himself just in time to fend off another blow from a warhammer. He countered and cut the man down, hitting him with the edge of his shield. All this seemed to be happening in some exaggerated slow motion, like running through deep water. It seemed as if each action, each motion was set apart in its clarity and focus. He saw blows coming slowly and dodged them. He swung his sword and moved on, over and over, just as Alaric had said. They had driven a wedge in the shield wall, dividing the protection that was supposed to be for the kings. The breach was growing ever wider as the men with Edric filled the gap like the flood. Suddenly, standing before him was a giant Viking with a great sword held in his hand like a twig. The sword came down on Edric's shield and shattered it like crockery. He still held the handles of the broken pieces in his hand, the shield flapping uselessly in shards. He moved in close, as he had with his father, and slashed his sword across the leather covering of the great man's chest. His sword cut the leather and drew blood. The man roared in a rage, and brought his hilts down on Edric's helm. In an instant of clarity, Edric could smell the man's foul breath and the stench of his body. Edric dodged, but still the glancing blow left him stunned. He couldn't see or move for a moment. He felt his knees give way. The world grew silent as sense and reason began to leave him. There came in the stillness his father's voice. "With his pinions he covereth thee, and under his wings thou dost trust. A shield and buckler is his truth. Thou art not afraid of fear by night, of arrow that flieth by day, of pestilence and thick darkness that walketh, of destruction that destroyeth at noon. There fall at thy side 1,000, and a myriad at thy right hand. Unto thee it cometh not nigh." The world was tilting. He felt as if he were seeing it at the end of a long tunnel. He was on his knees, his arms clasping his sword, its tip on the ground. He looked up, watching the mighty sword falling to cleave him in two in one long, slow motion. It grew ever closer, and he could do nothing to stop it or save himself. "I am going to die." He began slowly to drop his head lower to avoid the blow, and yet he knew it would not be soon enough. As he was moving, he saw the man's bloodshot eyes turn away from him. The arc of the sword began to waver. A blade came through the air over Edric's head and caught the giant in the chest. The man was felled like a great oak. Edric registered the look of surprise in the man's eyes as the life flowed out of him. His hands still gripped the mighty sword, now useless. Edric felt a hand grab his arm and pull him up. He could see Alaric shout at him, shaking him, but he could hear nothing. They were in a small bubble of peace in the midst of chaos and destruction that was going on all around them. Edric slowly got to his feet. He took a deep breath, and reason began to return. The battle began to come back into focus to him, and he gathered himself once again. It seemed as if it had taken an eternity. He knew it could be only seconds of time. He saw the worry on Alaric's face. He saw the fear for him, and the slight smile that began as Alaric recognized Edric was shaken but not injured. The smile turned to pain as another warrior slid his blade under Alaric's arm where there was no mail. Alaric spun and jerked away, pulling the sword from the man's grasp as he moved and swung his axe to kill the man who had stabbed him in the back. But then Alaric faltered and dropped to one knee. Panic and fear seized Edric.
This could not be. His mentor, his protector, he could not be harmed. He could not be wounded. This was Alaric. This was Alaric. Alaric was down now. Alaric's arm reached up to grasp Edric. Follow the king! Follow the king! Follow the king! Alaric's eyes closed, and he was gone. Edric knelt in the midst of the maelstrom that swirled around him for a moment, making a silent prayer for strength, and then he gathered himself and picked up his sword and entered the torrent of the battle again. He lost all track of the passage of time. It seemed as if his entire life had been spent on this field of blood. His arm rose and fell without thought. He found another shield from some other fallen warrior, and he fought on. The shield walls surrounding the kings had broken. Small groups of the invaders were fighting their way to the edges of the battle and running for their boats, dropping weapons as they fled. The English pursued them, cutting them down along the line of retreat. Edric found himself with the pursuers at the water's edge, watching the nearly empty ships of the enemy pull from the shore with barely enough men to row them away. Flights of arrows followed them until the longboats were well out of range. A proud fleet of thousands had landed. A ragged few were sailing away. A great weariness engulfed him. He began to look around him at the men who stood beside him. He saw the blood and the wounds that none yet felt. Then he saw Aethelstan and his father on their chargers with the others in Aethelstan's retinue. But the numbers were fewer than when they had set out that crisp October morning that seemed years ago now. Many were the fallen. The black dog of battle had begun to settle in on those who had survived. They had won the war, but the cost had been great. Edric's father saw him and leaned in to ask the king's permission to go to him. Edric saw the crowned head nod once, and the king's eyes fell on him. Aethelstan smiled wearily and nodded his thanks and acknowledgment to a fellow survivor. He lifted his eyes again to the horizon where the ships of his enemies were disappearing in the distance. England would now be united, north to south, east to west. Aethelstan's vision would come true. Owain, Olaf, and Constantine were limping back to their own countries, their armies broken. Their greed and pride had cost them 5 princes, 7 barons. Out of the cohort of 15,000, only 3,000 returned to Scotland and Ireland. The kings had each lost sons, brothers, nephews on the blood-soaked ground of the Wirral. Bjorn got wearily down from his sweat-stained mount. Edric turned to his father and embraced him. The weariness overtook him, and he began to sob in great gulping gasps as the emotion of the day swept over him. His father held him close and let the tears fall. Alaric? Dead. He died. He died saving me. I should have been quicker. I should have been better. I watched. I could not stop his wound. He had saved me. I could not.
Peace, my son. Peace. He died in grace, protecting one he loved as if you were his own. He would not change places with you now in heaven for all the accolades of battle. We will find his broken body, and we will bury him. We will mourn him. We will remember his sacrifice with honor, and we will keep faith with his memory. Come. The 2 warriors, father and son, leading the great black stallion, made their way through the ruin of battle to the place where Alaric's body lay.
They found him easily enough. His body had not been disturbed, but already the carrion beasts were beginning to come to the field, circling in the air. The air was filled with the moans and cries of the wounded from both sides. The infirmarians from the monasteries were seeing to them. These holy brothers had followed the army, knowing they would be needed when the fighting was over. They were binding wounds, doling out sips of poppy juice to those in great pain and to those with no hope of recovery. Other priests were praying over the dead. Bjorn saw 2 of his own men picking their way through the bodies, looking for their own dead. He called to them and gave orders that they were to find a litter, bear Alaric's body to a place where he could be buried. They would find a priest, they would have a service. There would be others who would not return to their village, who would be mourned as well. It seemed an age since the dawn had come that morning, and yet darkness had not fallen on this October day. Both men felt spent, empty. Edric looked out of the field of the fallen, and he knew he would remember this day for the rest of his life. He took off his helmet and saw the crease the great sword had caused, and realized just how close he had come to death. They returned to their tent to wash and don clean tunics for Alaric's service. Edric finished before his father and sat on his cot, turning the pages of the book the king had presented to him. His eyes fell on the passage near the end. He began to translate it from the Latin. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever believeth in me shall never die. The tears rolled down his face again, because he knew he would see Alaric one day. I will read this at his service, he thought. Darkness had fallen by the time all was ready. By torchlight they laid Alaric to rest. The priest said his words over him. Then Bjorn spoke, and finally Edric read from the book of John that the king had given him. The 2 of them each took a wooden spade of dirt and began to fill in the grave. They returned to their tent. The weariness of the day overtook them. The sun was quite high when Edric woke the next day. It took a moment for him to remember where he was and why he was here. The events of the battle swarmed in on him, and he was almost overcome. His father came in with some food, and Edric's world began to right itself. He was sore. His body was covered in bruises, and he had no memory of how some of them had been received. His superficial cuts had been dressed, and he showed very little damage from the day before. His father also had a few cuts from blades that had made their way past his chainmail, but he too was little hurt. We have been summoned to see the king. Dress yourself, and we will go. In Aethelstan's compassion he told me not to wake you, but come when you are ready. Not all kings are so nice-minded. Once again they were announced. Aethelstan looked much the same as he had on their first meeting, perhaps a little darker about the eyes. Once again he stood and came round in front of the table laden with maps and books, and again Aethelstan greeted them warmly. Young man, you have served me well. You have fought bravely, more bravely than many your senior. You are young, and have your life before you. I have many boons within my power to grant. Your father is my reeve, and I would have you follow in his footsteps if you will. But what now is your wish? Sire, yesterday was a day of darkness and light for me. Light because the battle was won, your crown secured, our nation united, but dark because one dear to me was lost in the battle. If I may be so bold in my youth, I will I will let his last words guide me in my choice. Young man, do not hesitate to share these words. I shall not stop your tongue. Speak freely. Alaric was my teacher, my mentor, my friend, my brother in grace. He held you in high regard. His dying words as he breathed his last were these: "Follow the king." And so I would, sire, all the days of my life. I shall follow the king. The end.